just speak very briefly. I'm absolutely welcoming the bill to the House, and I'm also just wanted to speak briefly in support of my colleague Senator Éireann's amendment. I think, as we said, when she talked about a fourth referendum, I remember the first referendum on divorce, and it was probably the scariest public speaking of my life, as I was studying the Gaeltacht at the time, and I was, I think, 9 or 10, and was the only child in the class to speak in favour of the concept of divorce in quite poor Irish at the time, I remember, on my own. And of course, that referendum was not passed at that time. And much later, as a student in UCD, I joined with staff and students there in campaigning for the right to divorce. And between that period, the debate had evolved, and the divorce referendum did pass at that time. And again, in the years since the referendum passed that brought in the right to divorce in Ireland, we've seen a huge amount of changes and evolution. The understanding of equality issues within families have changed. We've seen that Ireland didn't have, as was feared at the time, a huge wave of divorce, but what we did have was a greater openness and transparency around issues of equality in the family. Since then, of course, we've had changes to rights in different areas, and we've also had, and I think this is really why I support Senator Éireann's amendment, is it gives that space for the legislature to respond to the evolving landscape. Minister, even in the last few years, we've seen, for example, issues like coercion and control, which previously might not have been reflected in trying to understand what is or isn't reconciliation, or is or isn't authentic reconciliation, or what is in fact coercion. We have the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, again, which looks to kind of important issues in terms of legislating and protecting on issues of violence, which are, of course, a factor, contributing factor. In terms of the areas of children's rights, we do have, I think, a very strong provision at last in our Constitution around the rights of the child, which perhaps, again, would alleviate the necessity for that provision around the welfare of children that is there at the moment, and is the kind of perhaps a more appropriately wide constitutional provision which the judiciary can have consideration to, without the kind of more detailed and directive content that is there. Now, Minister, I understand that the legislation is coming, that there is scope to set the tone of how this might be interpreted, and in the terms of the guidance, which are of course non-binding, but the guidelines to the judiciary, that you're going to address this. But I would say that this is an opportunity to move this area of often a very difficult decision that people are making, often a very sad issue of marital breakdown, to move it into an area whereby we have a responsive legislature that responds in an appropriate way to the evolving national and international understanding on these issues, rather than having to come back perhaps in another decade and look to amend it again. Again, if we have to come back in a decade, we will, and that will happen at that time. But Minister, I'd love if you could address how you see the proposals and very, I think, valid concerns brought forward by Senator Éireann to be addressed. And I would just state again, I will be supporting the bill, and I will be supporting this referendum to, again, move to have a more humane understanding and practical understanding of marital breakdown in Ireland. Thank you.
Minister, you might like to